The Young and the Restless spoilers. Audra Cortez had always believed that names were costumes, and that if you wore the right one long enough, the world would forget the old skin underneath. Charles had fit her like a designer mask, polished and respectable, free of the stains that clung to the surname Cortez like a shadow. She had slipped into it after the first disaster, after the $500,000 check she took that never should have been hers, after the night where panic and greed and wounded pride collided and pushed her over a line she could never uncross. That stolen money was more than a crime, it was a pivot point. From that moment on, Audra knew that she could no longer be the girl she had been. She became someone else, someone willing to turn her back on the life that had shaped her, someone who understood that survival sometimes meant burying your own identity. The months that followed hardened her resolve. She left behind stories, questions, and people who would have sworn they knew her. But the girl they knew, Audra Cortez, was gone. In her place stood the woman the world would eventually come to know as Audra Charles, a name that spoke of control, reinvention, and calculated ambition. Yet lies, like stolen checks, have a way of maturing over time, and the secret she thought she had locked away in Los Angeles was beginning to ripen into a new kind of ruin. By the time Nate Hastings met her, years later, she had perfected the performance. The stolen check was no longer a memory that made her stomach twist. It was part of the foundation she had poured concrete over. What she had done after that, a worse act, one she rarely allowed herself to replay in full, was buried even deeper. Los Angeles had been a storm that she pretended was just weather, something she had walked through and left behind. On the surface, she moved through Genoa City as the confident, razor-sharp executive who seemed perpetually poised on the verge of another promotion, another conquest, another carefully negotiated victory. Beneath that surface, however, the past lay coiled like a snake around her ribs, and the more she tried to ignore its presence, the tighter it seemed to constrict. When Nate stepped into her life, he did not know any of that. He saw a woman whose pain manifested as arrogance, whose intelligence came with teeth, whose ambition clicked cleanly into his own. She intrigued him. She pushed him. She tempted him to step outside the predictability he'd previously chosen. And for a time, they gave into the dangerous chemistry that simmered between them, both professionally and personally. But that era had ended in fragments. Nate had chosen a different path, one that eventually led him back into the orbit of Victoria Newman, a woman whose flaws were well documented but whose strength, loyalty, and history with him seemed, to many, like a healthier fit than the tempestuous chaos he'd shared with Audra. Victoria was, in many ways, everything Audra was not. Established, grounded in her family's dynasty, capable of stability even amidst scandal. She was far from perfect, but she was not built on the same kind of unresolved wreckage that lay buried within Audra's past. And for that reason, the contrast between them could not be ignored. To the outside world, and certainly to Nate himself, Victoria was a good choice. She had a clear moral compass, even when it tilted under pressure. She cared about him not as a pawn or a stepping stone but as a man. Nate's renewed connection to Victoria stood in increasingly stark contrast to the version of himself that had once been entangled with Audra, a reminder that he could pursue something more balanced, less chaotic, more sustainable. Audra saw this clearly, and it gnawed at her. She knew Victoria was a positive influence. She knew that Nate's friendship and brief romance with Victoria had been rooted in mutual respect, shared values, and a kind of corporate camaraderie that didn't require deception to function. But knowing all of that did not soften the blow of watching him edge closer to Victoria again. Audra still wanted a second chance. She approached Nate with apologies lined up like carefully chosen shoes, ready to slip into whichever one might carry her back into his good graces. She told him she could do better. She insisted that she had changed, that the ruthless edges could be softened, that the treachery he associated with her was not the only truth about who she was. Yet even as she pleaded for forgiveness in moments that made her skin crawl with self-awareness, she held back the one thing that might have made her apologies truthful, the full story of what had happened in Los Angeles. That event, those choices. were the fault line running beneath everything Audra had built. She hid behind the name Charles, behind her professional accomplishments and carefully crafted persona, but the real fracture lay out west, in a story that was no longer hers alone to shape. Holden Novak had picked up the cracked fragments of that past and handed them quietly, devastatingly, to Claire Newman. The incomplete version he shared, a story without full context, but enough to paint Audra in the harshest possible light. Spread like a hairline fracture through the lives connected to it. Claire, already grappling with questions of identity, legacy, and the consequences of deceit, now held a piece of Audra's history that could shatter what little stability Audra still clung to. Holden's decision to share what he knew did not come with malicious intent so much as an inevitable, almost clinical sense of exposure. He had information. He shared it. But the effect on Audra was catastrophic. It was as if she had thrown a boomerang years ago out of desperation, believing it would disappear into the horizon, only to now realize it had been circling silently, gathering speed, and returning with enough force to knock her flat. The cruelest part was that Audra had always known this was possible. You could change your name, your zip code, your job, your relationships, but you could not outrun the truth forever. She had hoped, foolishly, that enough time and reinvention would bury the past so deeply that no one would bother digging it up. But Holden's partial revelations to Claire destroyed that illusion. They turned her history into a weapon now resting in the hands of people who had far more power, influence, and reach than she did. If Claire began to connect the dots, or if Victor, or even Victoria, caught wind of the truth, the delicate scaffolding of Audra's new life could collapse in a heartbeat. And that realization did not just threaten her career, it threatened the last shreds of dignity she had been trying to glue back together. Layered over all of this was the curse of her association with Tucker McCall. Their origin story had always sounded more elegant when dressed up in euphemism. Saying that Tucker had met her when she was still in college made it sound like a chance connection between a young woman with potential and a seasoned businessman willing to take her under his wing. The reality was more complicated and far more troubling. Tucker had seen in her not just beauty and drive but a certain morally flexible sharpness, a willingness to bend rules if the payoff was worth it. That quality, which had once led her to a stolen check and worse, had also drawn Tucker in. He saw her as an asset, someone he could mold, someone he could train, someone whose instincts could be turned into weapons in the corporate arena. She quickly became more than an intern or an assistant. She became his business protégé and, inevitably, his lover. They forged an arrangement that was mutually beneficial but never truly balanced. In the end, Tucker always held more power, because he had the experience, the connections, and the ability to walk away unscathed in ways she couldn't. Still, Audra learned a great deal from him. She learned how to play long games, how to anticipate weaknesses, how to read a room and adjust her posture, her tone, her entire essence in accordance with what would yield the greatest advantage. Tucker used her, but she also used him, absorbing everything she could. The alliance between them was transactional to the core. That was why, when the time came, betrayal felt less like a moral breach and more like a calculated inevitability. When Tucker's story on the canvas began to turn downward, when it became clear that his power was slipping or his plans were misaligned with her own ambitions, she saw an opening elsewhere, specifically with Victor Newman. Working for Victor to secure Glissade was meant to be her big, clean break, a chance to step out from Tucker's shadow and into the orbit of one of the most powerful men in Genoa City. That decision, at the time, had seemed sharp, cutting, and worthy of the woman she was trying to be. Yet, like so many of her choices, it turned out to be a miscalculation wrapped in the illusion of brilliance. She underestimated Victor's tendency to turn even the most promising opportunities into pieces on a larger chessboard. Her efforts to win Glissade for him were ultimately overshadowed by his own agenda, which involved bringing Kyle Abbott into the company not just for business reasons, but as a wedge intended to pry Kyle away from Summer Newman. It was classic Victor, using corporate maneuvering to influence deeply personal dynamics. In that larger game, Audra was just one of many instruments. Her betrayal of Tucker, while satisfying in one sense, left her with fewer allies and no guarantee of lasting security. When the dust settled, she was not the queen rising in triumph over the fallen king. She was simply another peace Victor had moved, tested, and set aside as he pursued a goal that had nothing to do with her. Now, as the truth about her past in Los Angeles crept closer to the surface and the story of Audra Cortez began bleeding through the veneer of Audra Charles, she found herself backed into an emotional and strategic corner. Her plea for a second chance with Nate was not just about romance. It was a symptom of something deeper, a desperate need for at least one person to see more in her than a string of schemes and betrayals. She wanted Nate to see the woman struggling beneath the mistakes, the woman who had done unforgivable things but who still believed, perhaps naively, that she could evolve into something better. But the irony was as bitter as it was inevitable. The more she hid from him, the less that hope made sense. By keeping quiet about Los Angeles, by clinging to half-truths and omissions even as she begged for forgiveness, she ensured that any second chance he gave her would be built on yet another foundation of lies. The boomerang was already in flight. Holden's incomplete confession to Claire had set it loose. Tucker's history with her, once an advantage, now made her look like a recurring villain in a story that the Newmans were becoming increasingly invested in. Victoria's comparative purity in Nate's eyes only sharpened the contrast between who Audra wished she could be and who her record said she was. Every choice she had made, in Los Angeles, with the stolen check, with Tucker, with Glissade, with Nate, had moved her steadily toward this point where the cost of reinvention was finally catching up to the life she had tried to construct. And so Audra stood in a familiar but terrifying position, one she had spent years trying to avoid. On the edge of exposure. She could continue hiding behind the Charles surname and hope that the storm blew past her, that Holden's words wouldn't carry as far as she feared, that Claire would keep the revelations contained. Or she could do the one thing she had resisted for as long as she could remember, step forward and own the parts of herself she had buried, risking total collapse for the chance at real, unvarnished redemption. Whether she would find the courage to do that remained uncertain. But one thing was no longer in question, the past was no longer safely sealed in another state, another name, another life. It was here now, in Genoa City, reflected in the wary eyes of those around her. And for Audra Cortez, no matter how long she had called herself Charles, that realization marked the beginning of a reckoning she could no longer postpone. Damian Kane's arrival in Nate Hastings' life had felt less like the introduction of a new character and more like a crack in the universe, a fissure that revealed how much could exist just beyond the edge of what someone believes they know about themselves. For years, Nate had moved through the world as an only child in practice if not entirely in principle, a man who carried his lineage through medicine, duty, and moral wrestling matches, but never through the shared shorthand that only siblings understand. When Amy Lewis, with her cool clinical certainty, confirmed that Damian was his biological brother, the news landed like a blow and a blessing in equal measure. Damian rejected it at first, his pride and his defenses rebelling against the idea that his bloodline had been kept from him, that some force of chance or design had deprived him of a brother for so long. He pushed back, tried to poke holes in the claim, tried to pretend that genes alone were not enough to bridge years of separation. Yet for all his resistance, the truth had a gravity he could not ignore. The tests did not lie. The circumstances aligned. And slowly, the skepticism in Damian's eyes changed into something rawer, more vulnerable, a cautious acceptance that he and Nate were linked by more than circumstance. Once that barrier fell, Nate attached himself to his brother with a quiet intensity that surprised even him. He didn't want to waste time. There was so much he didn't know about Damian's childhood, his mistakes, his victories, the ghosts he carried, the choices that had shaped him into the man standing in front of him. Nate began to peel back the layers, not as a doctor dissecting a case history but as a brother trying to make up for lost years with every conversation, every shared memory retold, every point of common ground discovered late but cherished all the more because of it. Damian, in turn, seemed to soften under Nate's attention. He began to lean into the reality of brotherhood, feeling what it meant to have someone who was not a lover, not a parent, not a rival, but a mirror, with all the shared code and inherited shadows that came with that. Just as they began to move from guarded curiosity into genuine connection, just as Nate started to imagine a future where Damien was simply part of his life and not an ongoing revelation, the universe, or more accurately the twisted logic of Genoa City, ripped that possibility away in a single, brutal stroke. Carter, Kane Ashby's fiercely devoted yet deeply unhinged assistant, became the instrument of that loss. His loyalty to Kane had always been warped, rooted not in clear moral reasoning but in a fanatical belief that he existed to fix what Kane could not face, to remove obstacles Kane did not even fully articulate. When Carter became convinced that killing Damien would somehow help his boss reclaim Lily Winter's love, that eliminating this man would untangle emotional knots and rewrite romantic destiny, the decision formed in a mind already fraying at the edges. In Carter's disturbed logic, Damien was not a person, he was an obstruction in a narrative where Kane and Lily were meant to end up together. So he acted. Violence in Genoa City was rarely random, but it often felt senseless, and Damien's death was a prime example. Nate did not just lose a brother, he lost the fragile, shimmering possibility of knowing him, of arguing with him, of leaning on him when his world tilted sideways. That budding bond was severed just as it began to root, leaving Nate clutching grief that felt both enormous and strangely abstract, grief for a man he had barely gotten to love, grief for a relationship that died before it had a chance to fully live. The reverberations of Damien's death rippled through Nate's life, sharpening his sense of injustice and deepening his skepticism about trust. It also cast a harsher light on the relationships around him, particularly as the web around Kane, Carter, and the south of France disaster tightened. While Nate wrestled privately with the loss of his brother, another storm was brewing that would drag him into emotional terrain just as treacherous. Audra, brilliant, volatile, intoxicatingly flawed Audra, returned from a catastrophic trip to the south of France carrying more than luggage and exhaustion. She came back with secrets, consequences, and the unmistakable scent of scandal clinging to her like perfume. On that trip, her entanglement with Kyle Abbott had finally crossed the point of no return. Whatever she had tried to frame as strategic alliance or momentary misstep was laid bare as something more personal, more reckless, more devastating to her claim that she was wholly committed to Nate. The Dominic persona that had been crafted, one more mask in a world of layered identities, was exposed, and with it, the scaffolding of lies that had helped Audra move through spaces she was not meant to occupy collapsed. Nate learned the truth about what she had done with Kyle, the flirtations, the emotional overlap, the romantic energy that coexisted with her declarations of loyalty to him. For a man already bruised by the theft of his newfound brother, this revelation hit like another kind of death. It wasn't just that she had betrayed him. It was that she had done so while clinging to him with the language of exclusivity, of devotion. The betrayal confirmed something Nate had always feared about his connection with Audra, that he was not her anchor but her option, one of several emotional gambles she was willing to make at once. Audra, confronted with the truth, spiraled into devastation. Her sharpness, the biting edge that she used on others when she sensed weakness, now turned inward. She believed, stubbornly, that she could still turn her luck around. She had done it before, survived, reinvented, charmed her way from precarious edges back into solid ground. Why should this be any different? But the pattern was there, undeniable and damning. Her alliance with Tucker McCall had never truly been an isolated choice. It had been the start or the continuation of a cycle, a template she repeated over and over again. She tied herself to powerful, dangerous men, justified the compromises she made as strategic, and then tried to hold on to them while simultaneously chasing emotional fulfillment elsewhere. With Tucker, she had blurred lines between apprentice, accomplice, and companion. With Nate, she had presented herself as the woman who saw his potential, who wanted to climb with him, matching moral conflict with ambition. With Kyle, she had indulged in a connection she tried to tell herself was temporary and inconsequential, even as it eroded the foundation of her supposed loyalty to Nate. Claiming that she was all in with Nate while still nurturing feelings for Kyle wasn't just dishonest, It was selfish, an act of emotional hoarding that reflected a deeper inability to commit to a single path. Now, as Nate began to find comfort and steadiness in Victoria Newman, Audra was forced into a cruel clarity. The new connection between Nate and Victoria was not built on fantasy or adrenaline. It grew from shared understanding, mutual scars, and a desire to step into something less combustible. Victoria did not need Nate to be broken to love him. She did not require chaos to feel alive. For Nate, who had watched his life tilt from family tragedy to professional upheaval to romantic implosion, Victoria's presence felt less like an escape and more like a chance to breathe.